Hi, my name is Rachel, and I need to get something off my chest. Something I've kept buried for far too long. Before you judge me, please listen to my story. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, and I'm still struggling to understand how it all happened so quickly. It's a memory that has haunted me for years. Something my husband made me do that changed the course of my life. It all began a few years ago. My husband John and I had been married for almost 10 years. Like most couples, we'd had our ups and downs, but I never expected this. John was a loving man, but over time something changed. He became distant, more controlling, and less affectionate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the stress of work, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One evening, John came home from work with a strange energy about him. He seemed unusually cheerful, but there was something almost unsettling about the way he looked at me. We had dinner as usual, and just as I was about to clear the table, he asked me to sit down. His tone was serious, so I complied, my heart starting to race as I sensed that this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes avoiding mine. "There's something I need to tell you." I nodded, waiting for him to continue, but the words that followed were not what I expected. He told me that he wanted to spice up our relationship, that he'd been feeling bored, and that he thought it was time we tried something different. At first, I thought he meant a romantic getaway, or maybe some counseling to rekindle the spark. But no, what he was suggesting was far from that. "I've arranged for us to meet two men," he said bluntly. "They're coming over this weekend." I stared at him, not understanding what he was getting at. I didn't know if he was joking or if this was some kind of sick test, but his expression was deadly serious. My stomach churned and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What do you mean, two men?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're friends of mine," he said, trying to sound casual, as if this was normal. "We're going to spend the night with them." I was speechless. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what he was saying. This wasn't my husband. This wasn't the man I had sworn to spend my life with. He was talking about bringing two strangers into our home, into our marriage, as if it were nothing. The thought alone made me feel sick. But more than that, I felt betrayed. How could he even suggest such a thing? "John, have you lost your mind?" I finally managed to say, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This isn't us. Why would you even—" But he cut me off before I could finish. "Rachel, this is happening," he said, his tone sharp. "You have to understand. This is something I want, something we need." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I loved John, but I couldn't understand why he would push me into something so degrading, something that felt like it would destroy everything we had built together. I told him no, that I wasn't going to go through with it. I thought that would be the end of it, that he'd come to his senses and drop the idea. But I was wrong. Over the next few days, John became increasingly distant. He hardly spoke to me unless it was about the plan. He started coming home late, and when I asked where he had been, he gave vague answers. Our conversations became tense, and the love that once filled our home was replaced by a suffocating silence. I felt trapped, isolated, and confused. How had our marriage, come to this? By Friday, the fear had settled deep in my chest. John insisted that the meeting would go ahead, no matter what I said. I considered leaving, packing my bags and walking out the door, but I didn't. As much as I hated to admit it, part of me was still holding on to the man I thought I knew, hoping that this was just a phase, something we could work through. I wasn't ready to throw away our life together, but at the same time, I couldn't bear the thought of going through with this plan. Saturday night came too quickly. The men, John's so-called friends, arrived promptly at 8 p.m. I sat on the couch, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to hold back the tears. I didn't even know their names, and here they were, sitting in my living room, talking to my husband like old buddies. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to disappear, to run out of the house and never look back. But then John leaned over, his hand on my knee. "Rachel, it's time," he whispered. I froze, my mind screaming at me to get up and go, but my body refused to move. John's hand felt like a weight on my knee, holding me in place. I couldn't look at him, and I certainly couldn't look at the two men sitting opposite me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the room seemed to be closing in around me. "Rachel, please," John said again, his voice lower now, almost pleading. There was something in his tone that made me stop. It wasn't just pleading, it was desperation. For the first time in days, I saw a glimmer of vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't just about satisfying some twisted fantasy for him. It was about control, power, and something deeper that I couldn't quite understand. But that didn't make it right. None of it felt right. "I can't do this, John," I finally whispered, my voice breaking. "This isn't who we are." He sighed heavily and sat back, rubbing his temples in frustration. "You think I want this?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I'm doing this for us, Rachel. Don't you get that?" "No, you're not," I shot back, finding a shred of strength. "You're doing this for you. You've changed, John. This isn't about us anymore. It's about control." For a moment, I thought I saw guilt flash across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Instead, he clenched his jaw and stood up, pacing the room like a man who had lost his way. I wanted to reach out to him, to pull him back to the man I once knew, but I didn't know how. We were so far from where we started, and I wasn't sure we'd ever find our way back. As the silence stretched between us, one of the men, let's call him Marcus, cleared his throat. He seemed to sense the tension, but there was an air of impatience about him. "Look," he said, his voice calm but firm, "if this isn't going to happen, we should probably go." I looked up at him, and for the first time I really looked at him. He wasn't what I had expected. He was calm, even respectful, and his demeanor seemed more sympathetic than I had imagined. I had this idea in my head that these men were predators, but they weren't. They were just people. And somehow that made the whole situation even more confusing. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to be part of what was becoming. But the weight of it all, the years with John, the love we once shared, the hope that maybe somehow things could get back to normal, kept me sitting there. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, suffocated by my own indecision. Then John spoke, his voice soft but determined. "Rachel, if you leave, we're finished." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. I looked at him in disbelief, trying to comprehend what he had just said. He had drawn a line in the sand, and I had to decide which side I was going to stand on. I felt tears well up in my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let him see me break. "I've given you everything," he continued, his voice calm but cold. "I've provided for you. I've loved you. And this one thing is all I ask for in return." I stood up, my legs shaking but determined. "This isn't love, John," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is manipulation." His eyes flashed with anger, but I didn't care. I couldn't do this. I wouldn't do this. I turned towards the door, fully expecting him to shout, to grab me, to try and stop me. But he didn't. Instead, I heard him mutter something like, "You're going to regret this." Maybe I would. Maybe leaving was a mistake. But in that moment, I knew I had to go. I couldn't let John or anyone else force me into something I didn't feel comfortable with. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. My legs carried me down the street, my mind racing. Where would I go? What was I going to do? I had no answers, only a deep sense of betrayal and loss. I walked for what felt like hours before I found myself outside my best friend Sarah's house. I knocked on the door, praying that she would be home. When she opened the door and saw my tear-streaked face, she didn't ask any questions. She just hugged me tightly and took me inside. I stayed with Sarah for the next few days, trying to process everything that had happened. I felt empty, like a part of me had been ripped away. I missed John, but I also knew I couldn't go back. The damage had been done, and there was no fixing what had been broken. John tried to call me a few times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry. He was all over the place, and I couldn't keep up with his changing emotions. I didn't answer any of his calls, and eventually he stopped trying. Months went by, and I began to rebuild my life, slowly but surely. I filed for divorce, knowing that our marriage was beyond saving. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but in the end it was the right one. I couldn't stay in a relationship where I was being manipulated and forced into situations that went against everything I believed in. I still think about John sometimes, about the life we could have had if things had turned out differently. But I've come to realize that I deserve better. I deserve a love based on trust, respect, and mutual understanding, not control and manipulation.